think I will go ahead and start us on our last presentation in this series, which is from, and I hope I pronounced it right, Adom Getachew. Sorry for apologies for any mispronunciations. And yes, so this is the final speaker in our series this year, the 8th speaker. And this is hosted by the School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. If you have any questions about this series, here's my contact information. The person speaking here is Nicole von Germatan. I'm the director of the School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. And so you can see my email there if you want to reach out with any questions regarding this series that we have sponsored since the fall of 2020. And we're thinking about maybe continuing it in fall of 2021, so that you can look for that those announcements, in a couple months. But we really appreciate everybody's attendance over all these talks. And so today we will have Professor Marisa Chappell from our history faculty as the moderator. And so I'll hand it over to you, Marisa, and thank you so much, and looking forward to a great talk.
Thanks, Nicole. And thank you for starting this series. It's been really amazing. Thank you to Aaron for your help making this happen. I'm going to give a land acknowledgement, and then I will introduce our speaker. Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinefu Band of the Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are a part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. I am thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Adom Getachew. Adom is Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. She's a political theorist with research interests in the history of political thought, theories of race and empire, and post-colonial political theory. Her work focuses on the intellectual and political histories of Africa and the Caribbean. Her first book, World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, reconstructs an account of self-determination offered in the political thought of Black Atlantic anti-colonial nationalists during the height of decolonization in the 20th century. She's also co-edited W.E.B. Du Bois's international writings and has written for numerous popular outlets, including the London Review, the Boston Review, The Nation, and the New York Times. Adom holds a joint PhD in political science and African American studies from Yale University and is on the faculty board of the Posen Center for Human Rights. She's a fellow at the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory and a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. And we're thrilled to have you. Adom's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions. Please use the Q&A function if you have questions, and I will moderate those after the talk. Thanks, Adom.
Great. Well, first, I just want to say thanks to Marisa for the invitation, to Nicole for hosting me in the series, and Aaron, who put all of this together for us, and all of you for joining the conversation. So my topic for today is, or my title is, A Common Spectacle of the Race, Garveyism's Visual Politics of Founding. And it's the first piece of a new book project on the Garveyism, the Garveyite movement of the 1920s, a kind of Black nationalist movement that had a wide-ranging global reach, over at its height, 6 million members, and a membership that spanned African Americans, West Indians, and colonial subjects on the African continent. So what I'll be talking through today is the kind of annual convention that was a crucial part of the practices of Garveyism. And to start, I'll be sharing a slide. Oops, it says I can't share a slide. Oh no, I can, just kidding. Okay. All right. The famed African-American photographer, James Van Der Zee, whose Harlem studio was a central fixture of the 1920s New Negro cultural renaissance, was asked in 1926 to photograph the annual International Convention of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This would not be van der Zee's first encounter with the UNIA. He had taken portraits of UNIA leaders in his studio and had also photographed the 1924 convention and the parade that occurred that year. So here are some pictures of the 1924. This is, of course, Marcus Garvey, the co-founder of the UNIA, and here he is in his famed plumed hat. This hat sits now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This is images of the UNIA African Legion, the men's paramilitary unit, and here is the women's brigade. But this 1926 image stands out in a number of ways from the earlier ones. First, though van der Zee and the subjects of the photograph might have not known it, this would be the last UNIA convention in New York. He captured the UNIA at a moment of deep crisis after Garvey's arrest for mail fraud had intensified factional disputes among the organization's leaders. Second, that this image seeks to represent the convention in its totality. While van der Zee's portraits focus in on individuals and his pictures of the 1924 parade momentarily hold a small slice of those present, this image of the 1926 convention seeks to fully capture the convention. And you can see almost, this is the entire frame, the convention exceeds the photographs frames or the camera's frames. Young and old, women and men in uniform, academic regalia, or simply their Sunday best, the members of the UNIA exceed the camera's frame. Seated at the center dais, and sorry, this is blurry, it's zoomed in, are the UNIA's leaders. An empty seat here, adorned with regalia, marks the absence of Garvey. The image then fans out from this center with the gendered auxiliary groups, first the African Men's Legion in Black military uniform, and then the women of the Black Crosses in their radiant white, hierarchically ordered around the center. The rank and file members are further out from the dais, but also closer to the camera. Sartorial markers and placement make clear the differentiation among members. Yet their collective gaze, trained ahead and up at van der Zee's camera, indicate a unity of purpose, a shared vision of their movement. At a time when their organization was fraying at the center, recourse to the photographic image held the UNIA together. This artifact of collective forward motion captured in image the political program of racial unity that appeared at least momentarily unrealizable. Investment in photographic images was not a new feature of the UNIA's self-understanding by 1926. Visual representation had long been a key medium through which the organization conceived of its political program after its reconstitution following World War I. The UNIA had been first founded by Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood, his first wife, in Jamaica in 1914. At the time, the organization committed itself to imperial loyalism among Britain's West Indian subjects. After Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, UNIA members in Kingston expressed their loyalty and devotion to the British Empire, bearing homage to the great protecting and civilizing influence of the English nation and people. These appeals to imperial citizenship echoed African-American attempts at securing citizenship too through military service in this time. And through this appeal, they sought to secure the political standing of colonial and Black subjects within the British Empire. Yet by the end of the war, these appeals had not only fallen on deaf ears, but were violently repudiated in the racial terror that followed the end of military conflict. Garvey encountered this transformed political context in the United States rather than in the West Indies, where he pivoted away from imperial loyalism to a project of African redemption. He initially traveled to the United States in 1916 with the modest aim of raising funds to build a UNIA school on the model of the Tuskegee Institute. A year later, however, in the immediate aftermath of the East St. Louis pogrom, which killed 48 people, 39 of whom were African American, he was thrust into the newly formed New Negro movement. On the first anniversary of the riot, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League was incorporated in New York. Having abandoned the goal of building a Jamaican Tuskegee, Garvey now embraced the mantle of the wider anti-colonial demand for self-determination, seeing his organization in connection to efforts in Egypt, Ireland, and India. 3 years after this refounding in New York, the historian Robert Hill notes there were 418 UNIA divisions with an additional 422 awaiting charters. By 1924, the UNIA boasted 6 million members organized in 1,400 separate chapters or divisions. These divisions were concentrated in the United States and the Caribbean, but also stretched to Southern and Western Africa, and included one division in Sydney, Australia. A language of political founding marked this new phase of the organization's history. Addressing members of the New York division in the summer of 1920, Garvey declared, "We are a new people, born of a new day and new circumstance. We are born out of the bloody war of 1914 to 1918. My talk today is concerned with this constitution of a new people, attending in particular to the role of images, theatricality, and performance. For the UNIA, political founding was a vehicle through which participants came to understand themselves as constituting the figure of the universal Negro, a figure represented through the convention as a transnational and empowered political subject. Political founding was on this view a process of transforming one's own self-perception, of cognizing oneself as a member of a transnational people capable of transforming the prevailing conditions of racial domination. Attending to the visual politics of the convention, from the opening parades to the theatrical representation of the deliberations, I trace the ways in which the conventions were mobilized to cultivate new habits of self-regard among those who participated in these spectacular occasions. The idea of the people, as Kevin Olson has argued, works as a representational fiction, encouraging individuals to imagine themselves as members of a collective with a unitary political will. The UNIA's practices of political founding work to transform the self-perception of its members and, more ambitiously, Black people unaffiliated with the organization, such that they would identify themselves as constituting the figure of the universal Negro. Yet articulated against the backdrop of racial violence in the United States and globally entrenched colonial hierarchies, while seeking to constitute this new people across national and imperial boundaries, the UNIA faced a distinctive problem, a problem we might call the problem of colonial peoplehood. This problem, Nazmul Sultan has recently argued, with reference to the Indian context, emerges from the twinned problems of disunity and underdevelopment, which perpetually defer the people as a claimable subject capable of self-authorization. In the case of the UNIA, the constitution of a politically empowered people wrestled with the disunity of geographic dispersal and the ingrained habits and feelings of racial inferiority. In light of these conditions, the UNIA's conventions staged and performed political power as a strategy of instilling among its members and participants what Jason Frank, following John Adams, calls a reverential self-regard. By viewing themselves in their own acts of self-representation as constituting the universal Negro, the new people Garvey announced would come into being. And this is one feature of the improvement to which the name Universal Negro Improvement Association aspired. In the act of political founding, self-development is concerned with reorienting the perceived place and position of the Negro race At stake here is a reiterative education of the senses that enables members of the UNIA to cognize themselves as a transnational and politically powerful people. In what follows, I'll first describe the two dilemmas of peoplehood that the UNIA faced. I'll then talk about this idea of the common spectacle of the race, the ways it was staged in the parade. I then will look at what the role of spectators was, and we'll examine two different roles that spectators played. One, the descriptions of the parade deploy white spectators as mirrors, and we'll see how that happens. And then a second is that Black spectators are called into or inculcated into this kind of project of instilling self-regard. And if there's time, I'll think more broadly, generally, about the relationship between aesthetics and politics. So I'll close this now. Dilemmas of peoplehood. Making the case for the historic first annual convention of the UNIA scheduled for August 1920, Garvey declared every country has a constitution of its own, every nation has a code of government. The month-long gathering scheduled for August served a similar purpose, he explained in a letter accompanying, comparing the meeting of the UNIA's address to the 1787 Philadelphia Convention. Through this example, Garvey made explicit the UNIA's aspiration to political founding. Like the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention, the UNIA delegates were elected by local bodies of the organization to represent them at the deliberations of the international body. But unlike 1787 in Philadelphia, no delegates came to New York in 1920 with the aim of writing a constitution for a republic. The textual product of the convention was not a constitution, but the Declaration of the Rights of Negro Peoples of the World, a document that announced the new people as a political subject capable of self-authorization. While the convention did not produce a code of government akin to the Constitution of the United States, it participated in the practice of founding a new people. When Garvey noted, "We are a new people, born of a new day and new circumstance," he suggested that the birth of a people is an inevitable culmination of the radically altered political context of the post-war period. But Garvey never took this to be an inevitable process. In fact, he would argue, it was a difficult proposition to get Negroes to see through one common spectacle. Two conditions mitigated against the UNIA's efforts to constitute a new people: disunity and denigration. First, the present-day Negro was a scattered race. Imperial and national boundaries prevented Black people from recognizing their common grievance and common complaints. Working against national and imperial divisions, the organization aspired to instill among its members a sense of the global character of the Negro question. According to its international organizer, Henrietta Davis, when we scrutinize the attitude of the American, English, French, and German white man, we find that all four have the same opinion of the Negro. They all believe that the Negro should be a subject race, that he is not to have self-government, that he is not capable of taking a place in the great governments of the world. But if racial domination functioned as a common experience for UNIA members, an appeal to this experience alone had to contend with the different instantiations of racial oppression across the world. While nationality was an accident of birth, according to Garvey, the imperial and geographic contexts of UNIA members shape the precise experiences of domination and the possibilities for mobilization. The United States, Garvey suggested in 1919, still offered opportunities to fight constitutionally, while Africa did not and required a future anti-imperial struggle to free the continent. Similarly, Garvey argued that his position as a subject of the British Empire committed him to claiming his rights of citizenship. Developing a common spectacle did not mean that the organization elided these differences. In fact, during this first convention in 1920, A week was devoted to short presentations of each delegation representing local UNIA divisions. We want the convention to clearly understand the universal Negro question, Garvey explained, and this required hearing from representatives of Georgia, Mississippi, the colonies of Africa, the independent states of South and Central America, as well as the islands of the West Indies. Yet tethering together each local instantiation of the UNIA was a conception of a globe-spanning movement. As Garvey put it, the Negro's common expression exceeded these local contexts and required organizing a universal rather than a national movement. In other words, what made Garveyism a mass transnational movement was not only its ability to speak to local questions, but its capacity to invest each configuration of the movement with a far-reaching global significance. And this was the promise of the UNIA's universality. Such a project could only succeed, however, if UNIA members recognized themselves not only as similarly oppressed, but as also part of a transnational people that felt itself to be politically empowered. Here is where the second dilemma appears: the psychic and psychological costs of a habituation to racial domination. The Black race, according to Davis and Garvey, had for far too long accepted its own subservience. The old Negro, Davis says, had a subservient manner with hat in hand, a bending of the body, a shrinking look, and bowing as he says, "Yes, boss, yes, master," to every remark from the master. Through the UNIA, Black people were to understand themselves as political actors who no longer tamely submitted to the indignities heaped on us by other races that call themselves superior. Black participation in the Great War, Davis argued, already demonstrated that the white man has no monopoly on knowledge in either the fields of military and political arts or science, art, and literature. In her claim that the Negro was already equal to the white man, Davis echoed a wider post-war anti-colonial critique, which viewed the devastation of World War I as a total condemnation of European civilization. For Davis, the post-war period marked a break from the tutelary ideals of the civilizing mission. All that is necessary on the part of the Negro, she argued, is that the proper application of the knowledge he already possesses. That is, this is the voice of the new Negro, which emerged from participation and sacrifice during the war with a newfound sense of his own political capacities. The centrality of the war to perceptions of one's political capacity had a double valence. On the one hand, by highlighting the moral bankruptcy of the West and emphasizing the crucial role of Black soldiers, the UNIA rejected the view that Black people were politically immature or lagged behind other peoples. In this case, the UNIA's political project joined struggles in Ireland, India, Egypt, and Eastern Europe in an age when all peoples are striking out for their freedom, liberty, and for democracy. At the same time, the reoccurring reference to the Black soldier as the model of political empowerment rendered the universal Negro a masculine and martial subject. And we've already seen this in the gendered hierarchy that's inscribed in Van der Zee's 1926 photograph. We also see this in the ways that Garvey self-fashioned as this paradigmatic soldier statesman. Okay, now the common spectacle of the race. I want to now think through Garvey's use of the common spectacle for the ways it draws attention to the role of visuality, theatricality, and performance in this founding moment. As we will soon see, creating a common spectacle was understood as a lens through which Black people could see themselves. So the common spectacle is both a kind of, a visual aid, a lens, a glass, right, one can see through, but it's also it's a spectacular performance, one that draws people's attentions. And I think what's happening in the convention is that the spectacular is made into a form of lens and made into a technique and tool for viewing oneself differently. So for this part of the talk, I'll be drawing on the daily convention bulletin, The convention had a kind of summary, daily summary of what had happened. And this daily summary would also be published in the Negro World newspaper, which was a weekly paper published from 1919 up to 1933. So much of this comes from that source. The annual convention was a visual inauguration of the new people, united by common cause and empowered by a sense of political capacity. The division delegates, UNIA members, and spectators were assembled to produce a common spectacle through which they would come to perceive themselves as the universal Negro. The first convention in 1920 began on August 1st with the convening of 2,000 delegates representing 22 countries and ended on August 31st with closing ceremonies and parades. A parade on August 3rd started at the UNIA headquarters in West 135th Street, wound its way through Harlem. Representatives, there's an earlier parade too, which ends in Madison Square Garden, a very important one, and it would have 25,000 people present when they got to Madison Square Garden. Representatives of the Black Star Line and the Negro Factories Corporation, which were the two commercial enterprises of the UNIA, led the parade. Following in automobiles were Garvey, Davis, and other high officials of the association wearing their academic regalia. Behind them, the procession included the Black Star Line Choir, divisional marching bands, the Women's Black Cross Nurses, and the African Legion. Central to the image of a transnational people was a careful effort to conjugate unity and multiplicity. For instance, the parade reproduced the UNIA's divisional structure, organized by various local settings of its members. The Negroes of the world were not one undivided people, but represented under the banners of their respective country, state, or island. Additionally, the participants carried signs that reflected competing demands and political visions. Slogans like Africa for the Africans, Africa, a nation one and indivisible, stood in conjunction with banners that read, "We believe in the liberal institutions of America," and "Long live America." Liberty Hall, where the convention proceedings took place, was decorated with buntings and flags of various countries, including England, Africa, the United States, Haiti, Panama, Central America, San Domingo, and other world empires and nations. In this way, then, the UNIA played up its transnational membership. It was the convention of the Negro peoples of the world, but one that sought to join the scattered race and consolidate its racial force. The parade synchronicity, produced by carefully tailored regalia and uniforms, as well as the choreographed tempo of the procession, weave together this tapestry of national affiliations and political visions to represent the universal Negro. Like the use of the tricolor cockade and proposals for a national costume in revolutionary France, the parade created virtual unity through symbolic means. Assembled together and marching in unison, the UNIA paraders transcended the specific claims and experiences of racial domination to manifest a new image of self-assertion and political empowerment. According to the convention's daily bulletin, it was a parade expressive, as it was intended to be, of the Negro's serious, his unswerving and unswervable determination to solve his own problems by larger reliance on his own resources and power. The image of an assertive and newly empowered Black race, the bulletin goes on to say, presented a thrilling, spectacular scene that was dazzling to the eyes of the most imaginative. This time, the coverage continued, imagination has been outguessed, as every onlooker must admit. The scene of the parade interrupts the public association of Blackness with denigration and recasts a racial unity predicated on disenfranchisement. In its place, it inserts an image of political empowerment, an image that acts out the as yet unrealized promise of self-government. It is an image of the unimaginable political power of the Negro race. And this is a dazzling picture, one that observers cannot take their eyes off. Twice, the bulletin describes the gaze of spectators as taking the form of a morbid curiosity that looks on as if the Parliament of Negroes was a circus. Observers at first experience awe and negative astonishment, but by the closing parade on August 31st, this initial affect is transformed into sympathy, respect, and admiration. This transformation of negative astonishment to sympathy and respect contains elements of a Burkean sublime. For Edmund Burke, the sublime had the quality of delightful horror, something that sounds like morbid curiosity. It initially produces astonishment before generating admiration, reverence, and respect. With this parallelism of the language, I want to suggest that what the mass assembly of the parade and convention produce is a sublime image of the Negro race. It is through producing this image of a powerful, awe-inspiring people that the UNIA members come to have reverential self-regard. What I like about this formulation is that it clarifies the stakes of spectacular mass assemblies and reframes the project of race pride with which Black nationalist movements are deeply associated. Black pride is often viewed as a project of affirming the historical achievements of African-descended peoples with the aim of undoing the social stigma and shame associated with Blackness. Now, Garveyism was invested in this form of race pride, but the parade and convention work less through appeals to a history of past achievements, and instead sought to engender an identification with this figure of the universal Negro through a present staging of political empowerment. There is a recursive quality to the working of race pride, understood as reverential self-regard, for it's one's own performance of empowerment that inspires reverence. But in order for this cultivation of reverential self-regard to work, it must be circuited through the spectator who can be awed, who can experience the transformation of negative astonishment to admiration. And here we turn to the mirror, a mirror of reverential self-regard. The bulletin thus zeroes in on the experiences of spectators. And strikingly, the spectators it employs are other disempowered subjects, women and the Irish, who might themselves have participated in similar stagings of political empowerment. Parades and assembly were crucial components of course, the suffragette movement in this period and of Irish nationalism. So let's take 3 examples. First, the bulletin tells us white women were seen to cry at the scene of the parade. This response to the parade's insistent note of liberty is not registered as emerging from fear of the uniformed Black paraders. Instead, their cries are spurred by having beheld the Negro achieving the measure of success that they themselves, under similar distressing conditions in other parts of the world, are fighting to achieve for themselves. Now, the 13th Amendment had just passed Congress only a year earlier and would be ratified as this convention took place. Here, the bulletin makes reference to the ongoing struggle for the right to vote in Britain, where suffragettes had won a partial victory with a 1918 expansion. Second, when the parade gets to 125th Street in Harlem, the bulletin introduces us to an Irish woman who, with tears upon her cheeks, in the anguish of despair, in the gloom of hopelessness, cried, "And to think the Negroes will get their liberty before the Irish." Her reaction is recorded as just one sign of a visible change in the attitude of the Irish towards the Negro as manifested in today's parade. A more astonishing and third example can be found among the Irish police reserves on duty during the parade, whose behavior was exemplary and so notably different from their customary conduct. While often violent and hostile to Harlem's Black residents, they are at least momentarily drawn to the sympathy and fellow feeling that makes us so wondrously kind to each other. This sympathy does not emanate from a pre-existing solidarity, but is catalyzed by the experience of viewing the manifestation of an assertive and empowered Black race. Though these depictions center the spectator's perspective, The affective response of white women and Irish police officers to the spectacle of the parade are not really the central concern. That is, these counts are not meant to signal that the UNIA can win over allies or persuade white audiences of the legitimacy of its cause. Instead, the reactions serve to reflect back to the participants and to the Negro World subscribers the political power manifested in the parade. UNIA members develop a reverential self-regard by coming to see themselves as representing a newly assertive people in the eyes of spectators who are also disempowered. That these are figures who might have known, engaged in, or know of similar efforts to stage the collective power of a disempowered group makes them particularly astute observers. But because self-regard depends in this way on the spectatorial gaze, it is a fragile enterprise, always in need of reinforcement. While the Bulletin narrative assures us that spectators have indeed been appropriately awed by the scene of Black political power, there is always a chance that the mirror of their gaze might not register the sublime image. The reportage includes the fragility of this dependence when it notes the reactions of white journalists who are dispatched to Harlem to cover the convention. These spectators, however, seem nonplussed by its unusual character and far-reaching objects. They view the project of African redemption as nothing but a wild dream. It is for this reason that the act of founding a new people could not be limited to one extraordinary moment. Instead, it was a reiterative practice, not only repeated annually at the convention, but also inserted into everyday organizational practices. UNIA uniforms, for instance, were worn at weekly meetings and sometimes outside of UNIA settings. Parades and pageants were also reenacted by local divisions of the UNIA. The perceptual shift required to develop a reverential self-regard sedimented in these recurring and recursive practices of staging, performing, and viewing a transnational and politically empowered spectacle of the Negro race. I now turn to the ways in which this spectacle enlists and elicits a response from Black spectators. So this is a description of how self-regard becomes contagious. While spectators are not the direct object of the UNIA's persuasive appeal, the convention did seek to draw in the far larger Black audience. Here we have the contagious character of reverential self-regard. The Bulletin tells us most Black attendees are initially curiosity seekers who flock to the meetings, particularly in the first week's sessions. At work here too is a morbid curiosity, an attraction that compels by being disruptive and disturbing. But in the course of attending the convening, curiosity is changed subconsciously to a feeling and spirit of enthusiasm by what they see and hear, only to be converted before leaving the room to a belief in the worthiness and greatness of the cause. The choice of conversion here suggests that passive, even skeptical Black spectators are drawn in so that they might identify the UNIA's political project as their own. To return once more to Burke, the sublime is associated with an irresistible force that compels and attracts. The awe-inspiring spectacle of the Universal Negro unmoors one from settled conventions, convictions, and perceptions. It compels and attracts new adherents. It is in this process of conversion that reverential self-regard becomes contagious. Spectators are drawn to identify with the image of the Universal Negro staged and performed during the convention. Central to this labor of conversion is this emphasis on what the Bulletin calls the perfect order and becoming decorum of the proceedings. It tells us there is a complete absence of those features bordering on the ludicrous and the grotesque, which is pleasing to the Black audience. The reoccurring emphasis on the orderliness of the convention bespeaks a self-consciousness about the critical and mocking depictions of the UNIA's spectacular and theatrical politics, even in the Black press. So for instance, W.E.B. Du Bois, a real critic of Garvey, jibed, "A casual observer might have mistaken the parade and the convention for the dress rehearsal of a new comic opera." Du Bois here recognizes the aesthetic quality of the convention, but where the UNIA aspires to a sublime image of the race, he perceives comedy. Against this and other mocking descriptions, the Bulletin draws attention to the ways the convention follows normative scripts of political assembly. It is a performance that properly acts out oratory, deliberation, and procedure. But rather than staid and subdued, it generates enthusiasm and excitement. Take, for instance, the public reading of the Declaration of the Rights of Negro Peoples of the World, which occurred on the 13th day of the convention. The Declaration, referred to as the Magna Carta of Negro Rights and Liberty, is itself a script of political claims making, which signals the UNIA's embodiment of proper political form. The act of declaring rights is recalled as a solemn, dramatic occasion. The Declaration is a sacred document because it is the declaration of a new race of Black people of the world who will no longer suffer injustice and wrong. Yet as each article is read, solemnity is interrupted by uproarious applause. The enthusiasm of the crowd exhibited in cheering and shouting, even whistling, with the waving of handkerchiefs, was almost indescribable. The audience is frantic with joy and unable to give sufficient vent to the feelings of approbation. Here, in a description that mirrors the experience of religious frenzy, the Bulletin aims to capture the UNIA's project of conversion. The image of self-authorization represented in the reading of the Declaration overpowers the audience. Their exuberant response has a spontaneous and contagious quality that envelopes the room. On the one hand, this response, the exuberance and excessiveness of the Black audience, registers once more the staging of political power. On the other hand, the response indicates the transformation of passive spectators into converts who have caught the spirit of the UNIA. These spectators are drawn to see themselves in the image of the Universal Negro being performed and constituted in the process of the convention. So if white spectators are introduced to mirror back an image of self-assertive and empowered race, the same image instills among its Black viewers an identification with the scene of political empowerment. And just as the white spectatorial gaze could fail to register the sublime image of the race and thereby threaten the development of reverential self-regard, this effort at conversion may also fail. The Bulletin notes that the enthusiasm generated in the course of the convention may not be enough to win over all viewers to the cause of the UNIA. For this group of spectators who are inclined to stay aloof, the fine musical program, eloquent, soul-inspiring addresses which filled the evening sessions were highly intended and leave some impression. Witnessing the scenes of dignity and solemnity sends a thrill of pride through every colored man and woman who see it, whatever their considered opinions of the UNIA might be. That the process of conversion to the cause of the UNIA may not be completed in the course of the convention indicates once more the fragility of the enterprise of political founding. The work of generating a common spectacle was, as Garvey put it, a difficult proposition, one that required reiterative staging and restaging. As an opening salvo to this ongoing practice, the first convention in August 1920 marked a rupture. It was the founding of a race that now, after centuries of injustice, was celebrating its new birth, the dawning for them of a new day, an age undreamt of by their ancestors. And this rebirth was centrally tied to the UNIA's visual politics, to its effort to generate a common spectacle, to set before Black people a picture of their own collective power. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here and take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Getachew. That was amazing. Please put questions in the Q&A. I have a couple questions so I can start. I'm really interested in this notion of the kind of contrast between the exuberant conversion that's reminiscent of certain religious experiences, and then the kind of emphasis on dignity and solemnity. And it just brings to mind the politics of respectability and the ways in which those kind of dynamics were constantly being played out in Black communities. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think so. Through this bulletin, there's a very explicit contrast to there's this kind of minstrel show called the Limekiln Club, which was this kind of parody of African-American politics, and it came out in the 1890s as a kind of as a pamphlet, and then it would be performed in vaudeville theaters. It would be the first kind of film that starred African Americans in 1913, and the whole it's kind of mocking Black conventions, and it's the oratory is all confused. They use Latin when it doesn't make sense. So it's this kind of just denigrating vision of Black politics. And the UNIA is very conscious of that. It cites this particular performance and it says, this is very much in contrast to that. It's really interested in emphasizing, right, that it's a practice or that the UNIA understands what proper political practice is, what it requires. And it is wrapped up in the politics of respectability, I think, very importantly. I mean, you see this also in the dressing up, and that form of not just the uniforms, but the Sunday best would be something that you wore to all your meetings, right? Not just the annual convention. So a certain way of thinking about respectability as less about, but I think as an internal project, an inwardly directed project of engendering self-respect, rather than one that thinks that acting out respectability will be the thing that wins one's like rights in the world. So E. Franklin Frazier has an essay about this in The Nation in this period, and he says one of the things that's really powerful about the UNIA as a mass movement, as a movement of working class people, is that people who are, he has one example, like you could be a janitor during the day, you could be work in these very menial jobs that you're constantly facing racial and class denigration. But in the evening, you go put on your uniform and you go to the UNIA meeting, you're addressed as fellow man of the Negro race. And all of these, like the accoutrements of respectability politics, the kind of various attempts at, playing on royal titles, on knighthood, etc. These are all, I think, best understood as inward practices of generating self-respect and self-regard, rather than ones that are preoccupied with white representations of Black people. I think the other point you make about, this kind of way in which, what's really interesting, I think, about the way that this kind of solemnity and kind of exuberance are being yoked together in this moment in the Bulletin's narration is, in some ways, the suggestion is that it's surprisingly dignified enactments of political power that generate enthusiasm, right? And there's a way in which that's at least what's being suggested, that one can get a kind of affective response from these acts that are like highly orderly, highly organized, right? And I think it's another way of also, more theoretically, for us to think about like the interplay between highly staged forms of political theater or mass assembly, and ones that are often considered, more spontaneous, and the ways in which those two things aren't like occur in different places, but can happen simultaneously and in relation to each other.
Thank you. That's so fascinating. A related-ish question is Du Bois's criticisms and other sorts of criticisms, if you could speak a little bit more about what those criticisms looked like.
Yeah. Yes, Du Bois, among a number of African-American writers in this period, were deeply, deeply critical of this project on several grounds. I think one, it's not their critique. I mean, Du Bois himself is engaged in all forms of aesthetic politics in this period. So he writes a pageant. Du Bois writes a pageant in 1911. As a celebration it would be staged as a celebration of emancipation, and it's a pageant it's called the Star of Ethiopia, and it's like a performance of Negro history from like the invention of iron in Africa, through the great empires of ancient Africa, and then into the experience of slavery, and then it sort of culminates with like Toussaint Louverture and Frederick Douglass marching towards liberty. And these were performed in a few times, 1911, 1913, and in the 1920s, to audiences that were as big as the parades that Garvey was interested. So the last time it was performed, there were 20,000 people. It was in LA. But so I think one kind of difference about these aesthetic projects is that, Du Bois thinks that his project is he says, I'm interested in engendering a reasonable form of race pride. And his pageant is also, he thinks the pageant can be a way of also transforming white perceptions of Black people. So he imagines both as kind of, audiences that would be transformed by the process of viewing the pageant. So one distinction for him is that he thinks this is just crass, right? That there's too much costuming, that there's also, all these kind of, especially in the 1921 convention, they introduced knighthoods, at the UNIA. There's always this kind of framing of Garvey himself as an emperor. So he thinks it's one too invested in the kind of in royalism, in monarchy. So that's one kind of criticism. A second criticism is that it's a form of demagoguery, right? That it's not really about the people, but it's all about, Garvey, and Garvey's at the center of it. The movement is called Garveyism, right? That it replicates a certain form of actually veneration of one figure. In general, I think underlying these criticisms, and Du Bois wouldn't be the only one who made such criticisms of the project, I think was a general set of questions about mass politics and a class anxiety about the ways in which working class people or the masses were being sort of hoodwinked into a form of politics that wouldn't actually be liberatory, right? And I think this is also connected later to, CLR James would make this point that Garveyism is like fascism in its kind of preoccupation with costuming, parading, etc. And this is a point Paul Gilroy also picks up on more recently.
Thank you. I have a question from my colleague, Dr. Plaza, in sociology. First, an interesting Oregon fact. In 1924, Marcus Garvey visited Mount Olivet Church in Portland, Oregon, as he was making his way through the western states of the USA to fundraise for the Back to Africa movement. All right, Oregon connection. The question, there are many Caribbean origin men and women who arrived after Garvey or were the product of Caribbean parents that went on to lead the Black freedom movement. Shirley Chisholm, Malcolm X, Harry Belafonte, Louis Farrakhan, Stokely Carmichael, Colin Powell. What do you see in Caribbean history, culture, values, or identity that provided many of these second generation individuals with the confidence and boldness to sort of rise up and take these leadership positions?
Yeah, that's a great list also because some of those people's parents were UNIA members. So one of the things, especially Malcolm X's mother was a very active member of the UNIA. She wrote for the paper. His father sold the paper, so he came out of a UNIA family, as did many other, people who were involved. I think the same is true of Stokely Carmichael's parents. But a number of other figures who were participated in the civil rights and Black Power movement. I think it's a great question about how it is this kind of, minority within a minority, West Indian migrants to the United States, really does become a certain kind of vanguard. There's a great book from the 90s called Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, which is a discussion of the kind of how the processes of West Indian migration to the United States and the ways in which they became, central figures, political figures in this period. I think, I don't have a definitive answer to this question, but I think one, the experience of sometimes a triple migration generated, various kinds of forms of radicalism. So many of the people who end up in the United States first travel from their home countries, Jamaica, Trinidad, other countries, to the Panama Canal, to Cuba as migrant workers, right? And this is their first experience for many of them of both. They have this deep sense of a crisis of imperial citizenship, right? The British Empire, who they call on consular offices for certain rights, to protect them in certain kinds of struggles around labor rights when they're on plantations in Cuba or on the canal. So they have an experience of the failure of the rights and protections of citizenship in this early moment, and these spaces of migration, labor migration, generate moments of encounter with other Black people from where they're located. They have an understanding of a kind of West Indianness that transcends the specificity of Jamaica or Trinidad or any of these spaces, right? So they come with a kind of regional and maybe global conception. I think that's one piece of it. And two, they've also been introduced to certain forms of political radicalism through this experience of labor migration. So that's one, I think, one way to explain this question. I mean, I think the other is that this is a period still where the idea of national independence isn't on the horizon, but I think the structures of race and racialization are very different. A place like Jamaica, even as there is deep forms of racial hierarchy, is a majority Black country or a colony in a way that the United States isn't. So the experience of, I think, minoritization in a democracy versus being a kind of colonial subject that is the majority in a particular place, I think generates different kinds of political visions and imaginations.
Interesting. All right. One comment, not a question, but a word of appreciation for the research. Your analysis helps me better understand the cultural work accomplished through the spectacles, parades, and early rituals of the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic confraternity of mainly Irish and Italian men in the same time period. And thanks for sharing your work with us. And then another question, could you talk about pursuing economic and political autonomy through the building of alternate institutions and structures by the UNIA? What was the focus and philosophy behind it?
Great. Yeah, I think, the UNIA is probably best known for the Black Star Line, a shipping company. And I think oftentimes there's a way that vision of the shipping lines is thought of as a kind of part of the Back to Africa vision of the UNIA. And I don't think of the UNIA as a Back to Africa movement. I think it never really thinks that it may recommend some forms of repatriation or return, but it's not a movement that imagines that people, territory, and state are going to all match up. So it doesn't have a territorially conceived idea of political community. I think that's one way in which it still conceives of it. It's still attached to the idea of empire, and that being a sense of a deterritorialized form of membership. So one of the things about the Shipling line, I think that's important as a kind of economic project, is that what it's really interested in is the circulation, mobility of people, of goods, and a way of linking through commerce, not unlike the British Empire, right? Through commerce, Black people, across these spaces. I think that's one vision of the economic vision. A second, there are these attempts to have Black-owned businesses in Harlem, in other parts, to buy Black, right, to support Black businesses. And I think these forms of sort of Black, whatever we could call them, Black capitalism, you can see that as a kind of running thread through Black nationalist projects into the later 1960s and 1970s as well.
Yeah. Thanks. Another question, once the UNIA was no more, what happened to all of this energy within the community? What was their outlet post-Garvey or post-UNIA?
That's a great question. I haven't gotten that far into the project yet, but I think one thing is, like I said, the paper ends in 1933, and even though the convention, I think what the end of the UNIA is, I think is hard to say. So yes, it has this like really high point in the early 1920s, but it persists in a variety of forms. So after the conventions end in New York, the annual conventions after 1926, there's an attempt to do them first in Jamaica, to redo them in Jamaica where Garvey has resettled. There's a brief attempt to do it in Canada, where there are chapters there too. The paper, which is, I think, the Negro World is probably the most important part of the movement, given it's like the way it reached so many millions of people, that persisted until 1933, and various UNIA chapters, went on until the 1950s. I think some still exist today. So there's a few remaining UNIA chapters in Philly and a few other places. But I think one way to think about this movement is that it was the site of incubating a set of ideas about racial pride, about self-determination, that would go on to become very important in the civil rights movement, in the anti-colonial movement. And one is like this generational piece that I was talking about, the fact that so many of the people who would become significant in that later period grew up in homes that were saturated by the experience of the UNIA. That's one. The other is just how much the kind of circulation of especially the Negro world was incredibly important to key anti-colonial leaders during this period, or during the 50s and 60s. So Kwame Nkrumah, who would go on to lead, Ghana, would say Garvey was the most important, most influential thinker for him. And he would call Ghana's, shipping company, national shipping company, the Black Star Line. There's a Black Star in the Ghanaian flag. All of these were ways of commemorating this importance of Garvey. Jomo Kenyatta reports reading the Negro World in Kenya, and how, in the context of high levels of illiteracy, there was this both a kind of translation of the paper into vernacular languages and a recitation of the paper, public recitations of the paper, as a way of getting people to have access to the information in it. So, I think of it as a really important space of experimentation, of incubation, and one that I don't think that means that the kind of decolonization we got is the direct directly follows the kind of politics that the UNIA generated, but I think it served as an important kind of site from which people, articulated certain ideas, engendered certain forms of self-understanding that would become really important in that later period.
Thanks. Curious about the specific religious influence on Garvey's ceremonies.
That's a good question. I still have to do more work on this, but when he first comes to the United States, the first time he tries to give a speech in Harlem, he faints and he's unable to speak. He faints. It's very embarrassing, and it's captured in a few firsthand accounts. And what he does in that period is begin to go to evangelical churches as a way of kind of learning, the rhetoric and stylings of the charismatic preacher. So there's a kind of rapid self-education that happens in the first few months that he's here, and then he goes on this speaking tour across the country. So I think there's very much ways in which certain forms, especially of oratory, rhetoric, charisma that were associated with evangelical churches, Black churches in particular, were really important to the kind of way in which the UNIA's practices were kind of constituted. The other thing is, UNIA meetings, the local divisional meetings, were held on Sundays. So people often describe going from church in the morning to the UNIA meeting, and it had a particular rhythm. So there was always a musical selection. There was always the anthem had to be sung. Like there was a whole kind of repertoire about it that, again, borrowed a lot from the kind of conventions of church structures. But I haven't thought more about the significance of those elements.
Well, thank you so much. We're about out of time, so I want to thank Dr. Getachew and also Natalia Bueno and Aaron Sneller and Nicole von Germeten. Thank you so much, Adom, for joining us. It was really great.
Thanks for having me.